My name is Dan Conway, and as Dibyesh said, I'm a senior lecturer in the politics department. We've been really honored to host Cynthia Enloe this week. And I and my colleagues were really reminded on Tuesday when Cynthia spoke to our undergraduate students that not only is she a distinguished and prolific researcher with 14 books and goodness knows how many other written outputs, but she's a gifted and inspirational teacher, someone who can really reach out to people and make them rethink and question the world they live in. And I know I'm not the only person in this room who's been inspired personally by Cynthia's work, who's maybe been inspired to be an academic as I was when I read Cynthia's work, but also who's benefited from her generous and critical engagement with my work and the incredible support she's given me through my career. And I think that's something that marks Cynthia, that generosity and wide, generous spirit. And Cynthia's feminist curiosity really spans far and wide, from women working in factories, women as diplomatic wives and soldiers, women as peace protesters, and men and women who are subject to militarization, subject in supporting it, in resisting it. And her interests span from Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, the US, the UK, and her work has never been more important in our conflict and crisis-driven world, and in a world where there are many people who seek to say that feminist questions are of the past, that we've moved beyond that, and that women and racial minorities, etc., have achieved rights and we don't need to question anymore. We do need to question, and I'm delighted Cynthia is here this evening, so please welcome Professor Cynthia Enloe.
You haven't even heard me yet. Thank you very much. You're very generous. It's great here to be with all of you. I've had a chance to talk both on Tuesday and at lunchtime today with a whole array of people here at Westminster. I am so impressed. This is a great university. Those of you who've chosen to come here or to work here, you're very lucky, and we're all lucky that you're all together. You know, 1 and 1 equals 6 when there's real good energy going. And Dibyesh and Dan have been very welcoming, but also have introduced me to so many of you. So I'm just delighted. As Dan mentioned, sprinkled through the audience here are people who've had an enormous impact on me in my own work and my own thinking. And so I'm delighted to see so many of them again, but also just reminds me that whatever knowledge we manage to gain, it's because of other people, right? Whenever you read, it's unfortunate, you don't see this as much in articles, but the thing about books is, here's a hint, always read the preface. Always, first of all, it's where all the gossip is, right? It's not called gossip, but it's like, who was especially helpful, and sort of how did this really happen, and did the dog really eat the first draft, and you know. But one of the things that usually is part of the preface, or sometimes it's separated and called the acknowledgments, is on whose shoulders did you stand in order to accomplish this work. And so the thank yous are not just polite. They actually are a diagram, if you will, of, so how do you do this work? How do you actually manage to make sense of something that when you started it, you could barely make any sense of? Well, you do it by, you know, thanking Jillian and thanking Maya and thanking Angela and thanking people that you've learned from. So if you are writing papers, or you're writing master's theses, or you're writing dissertations, or you're writing articles, find a way, if it's not a book, you don't have a preface, find a way though your first note is all your thank yous, right? Because it says to the reader, I didn't do this alone. I really required and built on the generosity of other people. Dan's very nice too. This is kind of embarrassing. I mean, it's kind of like, you know, a sales pitch. But one of the things that allows me to do, for me, is to say thank you to various publishers that I've worked with. Feminist editors are absolutely crucial to every book that you've enjoyed, all right? The editors, who are usually nameless, although they usually are thanked by the author, really make this possible. Booksellers make this possible. I'm a big fan of foils, as some of you know. I'm a big fan of independent booksellers. When they were on Charing Cross, I was a regular at Silver Moon, and before that, I was a regular at Sister Right. Now we're talking about feminist publishing history here. And one of the reasons that some of these books even exist at all is because I hung out. I was really kind of a bookstore groupie, and I hung out, be a bookstore groupie, it's a good thing. I hung out at feminist bookstores all around the world. But one of the things that is striking to me about this, and this is about how can you tell if you're becoming militarized, and that is choices of images. One of the things that I dealt with, really, I struggled with, was the cover for this book called Nimmo's War, Emma's War, Making Feminist Sense of the Iraq War. Images are so powerful. You all know this. If you get your image wrong, you get the whole message wrong, right? And furthermore, if you get your image wrong and it goes viral or goes out into the public in some form, then in fact you've lost any chance to discuss with the people who see your image what you really meant. You want to run around after your image and say, look, I really didn't pick this image. This isn't really what I meant. So covers are really explosive. I have a friend named Kathleen Barry, who was one of the first people to write about the international politics of prostitution. And she wrote one of these early books, and she was so worried that the politics of prostitution would lead to all kinds of cover designs that she thought would actually subvert her feminist message, that she's the only person I know who did this. She wrote into her contract, her formal contract that spell out the royalties and, of which there are not many, by the way, but they spell out all those conditions, right, that you and the publisher have engaged in. And she is the only person I know, Kathleen Barry, who wrote into her contract that on no edition of this book in any language, because it was going to get published in French and Japanese and Spanish, in no edition of any language of this book, including English, could there be a single image. There could only be letters, because she was so worried what would happen. Now with this book, Nimmo's War, Emma's War, which I wrote in the middle of the Iraq War, the American Iraq War, not the Iran-Iraq War, right? Not the earlier wars that Iraq had been involved with, but the US-led war in Iraq. I didn't want a militarized cover. Now this is about militarization and how can you tell what militarization looks like. I didn't want the following. I didn't want soldiers of any country to be featured on the cover. I also didn't want the cover to represent Iraqi women the way they'd been represented through almost all the media coverage during the long Iraq War led by the US. I didn't want women weeping. Try and just find pictures from 2003 to 2010 covering the Iraq War. Try and find a picture of Iraqi women, a media picture, where women aren't mainly in the act of weeping, as if that's the main thing women do. Well, men weep, women weep, of course they do. There's so much sadness, there's so much violence, there's so much distress. But that isn't mainly what women do. They think. Now that's a very radical statement, right? They think And I wanted to try and find an image that showed women without reference to the military in discussion with each other. And this is by an Iranian-Canadian photographer named Farah Ghosh. She's credited on the back of the cover. And what I love about this, it doesn't look like a war cover, does it? There's no tanks, there's no violence, and the women aren't weeping. What they're doing is the three of them seem to be maybe in their own apartment house having this animated discussion. Now, I don't know what the discussion's about, but you, the observer, I, the observer, we are incidental to that discussion. They have ideas, and they're all three of them, you can tell, they're all three of them in deep discussion. That was my little attempt to try and demilitarize an image of a book that was going to be about militarization. So to try and figure out to what extent one is militarized means that one has to be quite self-reflective. I've just been warned by the media people, don't get too close to that or your ears will burst. So if you see me edging any further over, just raise your hand or wave or something, because something awful is about to happen. But that militarization creeps into our daily lives. Militarization is not just about foreign policy. Militarization is not just about capital S, security policy. Militarization is not just about soldiers. Militarization is not just about militaries. Militarization is about a set of ideas, and it's ideas held mainly by civilians. I don't mean that you shouldn't be interested in what people who have joined any states or any insurgent forces military think. I think we should. But most of the militarized people on the planet Earth today are civilians, probably including a lot of us. So let me give you just a sense of some of the things that go into creating a militarized mind. One of them is, and Jeff and I talk about this because we talk about security all the time, that the world is a dangerous place. That has become such a normal, we talked about the quotes the other day, so, get used to it here. Hi, it's good to see you. So you never know who's going to turn up. But feminists put quotes around everything, and whenever we do it, which is very annoying, I know, it's just to put up a neon alert sign saying, when I say that word, normal, beware, be on your toes, keep your eyes wide open, because it doesn't mean what everybody thinks it means. So in this era, in many of our countries, in 2016, it has become normalized. That is a process by which something has been made normal. Underscore made. Somebody made it. It didn't fall from the sky. We live in an era in so many of our countries, whether we're living in Greece or in Turkey or in Syria or in the UK or in Hungary, we live in an era where the idea that the world is a dangerous place has been normalized. It doesn't mean that everybody thinks it. And in fact, I would hope that some of you think, well, I'm not so sure about that. But it's been normalized to the point that it is very hard to talk back to that idea, because it seems like you are simply being a reasonable person. As in, well, everybody knows that. Well, what if somebody comes along and says, well, there are dangers in the world, but also this world is a world of cooperation. This world is a world of creativity. This world is a world of commonalities. This is a world of possible allegiances and alliances that make for cooperation. To the extent that the world is a dangerous place, has become normalized, it is harder and harder for you to imagine saying any of those alternatives out loud or defending them. Now, that is the seedbed for militarization. It doesn't mean if you think the world is a dangerous place, and if you were living in Aleppo, Syria today, and you didn't think that, you would sound quite odd, right? If you were living, Angela and I were just talking about life now for women farmers in South Sudan. If you're living in South Sudan, it makes sense to say, my world is a dangerous place, because it is. So militarization happens by degrees, usually over time. What's so powerful about the idea that the world is a dangerous place is it kind of lays a groundwork. A groundwork on which other ideas that push you further down the militarized spectrum are made possible and even reasonable. The second idea is that human nature is selfish. Okay, all you political theory people, name the writer who that's at the core of his writing. Give me an H, give me an O, give me a Hobbes, right. He's not the only one. We're all like mini Hobbesians, right? To the extent, right, watch this, to the extent that we think that is normal to believe, that human nature is, at its core, selfish. Now, a lot of people don't believe that either. But to the extent that you think the world is a dangerous place, and you've also added on to that in your own worldview, we're not talking about an ideology at this point. We're just talking about how do you make sense of the world. We're not talking about some formal doctrine. But to the extent that you add on to the world is a dangerous place, the second belief that human nature is, in its essence, whatever that is, selfish, you've just moved a bit further down the militarized spectrum. You haven't picked up a gun, you haven't done violence to anybody, you haven't joined any military, you haven't voted for anybody who is going to believe in aerial bombing, you haven't done any of those things. But you've adopted two ways of making sense of the world that make you open to other beliefs that will push you further down the militarization spectrum. Now, the reason I talk about it this way, believe it or not, is because I'm a hopeful person. I know, it's hard. But militarization, for me, it took me a long time to come to that idea, and it doesn't trip off the tongue, militarization. It's much easier to say militaries. Militarization, though, because it's an isation, right? What are some other isations? You all know them. You use them in all your social science courses, and you read about them in the press all the time. What are some other isations that we just say in English all the time? Say it again. Globalization. Give me another. Colonization, of course. Naturalization, absolutely. Yes, indigenization and individualization and securitization, radicalization, urbanization, socialization, you know, racialization, privatization. You guys are good. Okay. But the reason that those words have become so valuable in our efforts collectively to make sense of this world is that they all describe, even if we don't know how to track them, they all describe step-by-step over time, processes. None of those terms, even though we use them kind of glibly, none of those terms describe a snapshot. All of them say, well, that village used to be a village, but increasingly, since the highway went through it, it's becoming urbanized. Becoming. Over time, I'm trying to track it. Socialization. Well, he used to, in fact, be quite an aggressive person as a young boy, but he's been socialized into adopting more effective conflict resolution strategies in his own personal relationships. And as a result of that socialization, he in fact doesn't act aggressively anymore. Over time, step by step. Which means you have to be able to track it over anything. Any isation, it is not a snapshot. It is not a moment in time. It is a process you have to figure out. You have to have your own strategies. You have to figure out how to monitor it in real time, over time. Militarization is exactly like that. It is something that happens over time to a person, to a university, to a whole society, to a political party, to a movement. Listen to Syrian feminists. And one of the things that Syrian feminists tell us, and by the way, you can listen to them. There are ways to read and listen to interviews by Syrian feminists who came out onto the streets in February of 2011 and were part of a mixed men and women's peaceful, pro-democracy, really pro-reform at that point, asking the Assad regime for specific reforms, not for the ouster of Assad at that point. Came out into the street in February 2011, calling for these specific reforms, men and women together, and when the Assad regime, this is going to be about militarization of a pro-democracy movement. You can militarize anything. That's the bad news. That with the Assad government's violent repression of that movement, many men and women who had been out on the street peacefully demonstrating for a more democratic way of Syrian life felt they had to take up arms against the repressive Assad state military. Other people thought that really, one, they didn't feel comfortable doing that, they didn't know how to do it, they didn't want to do it, or they actually thought it will not bring about the result that we want. And one of the things that then happened, has happened, and Syrian feminists describe this, one of the things that has happened is that the anti-Assad pro-democracy movement, now I'm not talking about some of the more religiously oriented insurgent forces that came in later. Let's talk about February 2011 to say about October 2011. Right? You've got to always have your time frame in mind when you chart things. And that, in fact, it's not only that the pro-democracy movement became militarized, that is, it became an armed insurgent movement, even though that wasn't the first thought in the people on the streets' minds. But, and this is one of the reasons why this is a feminist set of skills you should develop when you're looking at militarization, as the Syrian pro-democracy movement became more militarized, because they were provoked by a military assault on them, they became more masculinized. So that the movement for a lot of Syrian feminists became a movement that they did not feel part of, and the people who took the leadership in the more armed response to the Assad regime didn't think they were the natural, in quotes, members of. It doesn't mean that there aren't still Syrian feminists. It doesn't mean that there aren't still Syrian women who are very involved in humanitarian aid, in bargaining, really street-by-street ceasefires. We don't hear about this. Right? We don't hear, I mean, when was the last time you read an article in the press or online on Syrian feminists? But they exist. They're doing the work that isn't considered newsworthy because of the militarization of not just the press, which has now adopted the notion that the only thing that's newsworthy is what is militarized, because that is a shrinkage of what narrative is interesting enough to capture our attention. That is, to the extent that the coverage of the Syrian war has become militarized, coverage, media coverage, to the extent that the media coverage over time has become militarized, it means that the stories that are featured about Syria are militarized stories. The assumption is that we, the readers and the viewers, are likely to read those sorts of stories. We aren't as likely to read the stories about women who have no access to arms trying to do street-by-street ceasefires. That isn't as interesting. That's not as gripping. That is not as attractive to us. So blame the media, but blame us as well. So militarization is about ideas. That is, do you think the world's a dangerous place? Do you think that human nature at its core, always in quotes, at its core is selfish? Ideas are not values. Ideas are how you think the world works. And oftentimes, we had a great discussion at noon about when is the most awkward time to have a discussion with your family. Right? And it's always around holidays, isn't it? Really, especially the big dinner when, everybody's there and you just want to bring up something that you've been thinking about that's new and nobody else wants to hear it, and and then they worry why they're helping you pay the tuition if that's what you're learning, and but oftentimes where you think you and your family members, or you and your best friends, or who you thought were your best friends, or you or your new friends or your new work colleagues, oftentimes you think where you have the biggest differences are about your values, because that is what looks as though the gap widens. And your values are what you think are good or bad, what you value, what you disvalue. Is that all right? Devalue. Oh my God, it's on tape. Devalue. But underneath, try to have this kind of conversation with the people you disagree with, or the people you thought you always agreed with, and then you find yourselves, they voted one way on Brexit, and you would never have predicted they were going to vote that way. But now you think, how have I missed that all along, that we were going to come out so differently? And you really think seriously about your friends' thinking or your family members' thinking. Underneath values are beliefs. And that's why I started with the militarization of beliefs, because beliefs aren't the things you usually find yourself arguing over. Beliefs are how you think the world works. Not what you think are good or bad, but everybody knows that human nature is selfish at the core. By the way, the whole American Constitution is based on that belief. That's why you have the House versus the Senate. That's why the President and the House and the Senate all have elections at different times. That's why only 1/3 of the Senate at this time, and anytime only 1/3 of the Senate is up, so that all senators will never agree on anything because they've got 3 different clocks in their head. I'm not up for another 6 years. You're up this year, right? That the whole American Constitution is based on many ideas, but one of the key ideas is that human nature is profoundly selfish. This is James Madison, if you want to go look him up. And that no men are angels. That's the famous James Madison quote. And so he and others tried to design a structure of democratic governance that was based on the assumption that men and women, he was thinking mainly of men, but of men and women will be selfish if you let them. And therefore you have to constantly divide them up institutionally so they never can really get together. A third idea that is really highly, or leads to militarization, is the idea, again, it's not a value, at least not to start with, the idea that men naturally are the protectors of women who are naturally the protected. Now, this is a very powerful idea, because the idea, again, it's not whether it's good or not. The value comes in is when you judge a man or an older boy as to whether he is fulfilling his natural role as a protector, and then you judge him. So if you go into Tavistock Square Park, I think it's in that direction, there, you'll see a plaque there to World War I conscientious objectors. And you've probably seen it, and one of the major arguments that, in this case, men put forward who became conscientious objectors, that is, they refused to serve in the compulsory British military service of World War I starting in 1916. They argued that to be manly doesn't mean to be a protector taking up the weapons of violence. In other words, they disconnected manliness from protector from state military service. They said, take those apart. And there's a plaque to them in Tavistock Square. Go walk around. Gandhi is in the middle of the park. It's a beautiful small pocket park. And at one corner is a plaque to the conscientious objectors. But one of the reasons that conscientious objectors were so ridiculed, well, reviled, in Britain and in the United States and in Germany, because, and in France, was because they refused to play the role of manly men as armed protectors. Now, one of the reasons I've gotten so interested in this, I work with people who are very interested in masculinities and with the pressures on men to conform in certain kinds of not just masculinized ways, but militarized ways, is because it's so dependent on ideas about femininities. One of the things I've now become convinced on, thanks to the tutoring by so many of you, is that one cannot study masculinities unless you are truly, genuinely, energetically interested in the politics of femininities. There is no such thing as masculinity studies all by itself. If there were, it would just be called ordinary academia, right? Which is kind of men's studies, right? Right? What is really so exciting about the development of masculinities, plural, studies, is that those people, some of whom are here in the room, it's those people who are pushing forward that area of study know that they are standing on the shoulders of, dependent on, supported by, and informed by people who've done feminist studies of the workings of gender in a society. Because one of the most effective ways to militarize men in their hoped for achievement of the status of being manly is to call them a girl or gay, which is why you should always be interested in homophobia, right? Because it's wielded where, it can be wielded where there are no gay people. In fact, it's even especially effective when there are no gay people. Just try intimidating a boy or a man who is trying to fulfill some notion of being seen as manly by claiming that he's feminine. Because in a patriarchal system, otherwise known as all of ours, there's even Finland, right? My Icelandic friends, Icelandic feminist friends, say, don't always put us up as if we are the models. We deal with patriarchal bankers here, right? So don't put any country out of the loop of being curious about patriarchy. But that one of the things that really keeps a country militarized is the fear that many boys and men are taught to have. You have to be taught to be afraid. Are taught to have about being called feminine or a girl. And in fact, it used to be that drill sergeants, I'm very interested in drill sergeants, because drill sergeants are trying to take a vast array, usually of young men. The drill sergeants are trying to take a vast array of young men and turn them into quote-unquote proper soldiers. And it used to be, until there were more women in the ranks, it used to be that when you had a group of new recruits in front of you, the drill sergeant would come up, and this was the way to get young male recruits to fall in line and be afraid of the drill sergeant. The drill sergeant would come right up to the young recruit and yell, "Woman," as if he would fall apart. Because patriarchy depends on the denigration of anything feminine. Or that kind of charge wouldn't feel like a ridicule, would it? If you had real equality, somebody being called feminine, a man, a boy, being called feminine, would have no meaning at all, would it? It's only because of a hierarchy that values masculinities over femininities that you can wield feminization as an intimidating tool. And that is crucial to the militarization of masculinities, to the extent that any mother or any older sister or any girlfriend or any wife or any good woman friend of a young man or a middle-aged man, to the extent to which she also shares that notion. She also wants a manly man in her life. She, in fact, she's complicit in militarization. Masculinity as a tool of militarization would not work if a lot of women didn't think it made sense to them too. That is, patriarchy does not depend simply on men. Patriarchy requires girls and women to find satisfaction, to find reward, to find security in a certain notion of manliness. So that's the third belief. The complementary belief is that women and girls, there's a belief now, this is how the world works. Women and girls are naturally, that terrible word again, that are naturally the protected. Now here's the thing about being the protected. If you're the protected, you usually live in a confined spatial universe. You're usually the person who needs to be protected, so you stay close to home. For instance, a very good friend of mine, a Chilean feminist anthropologist named Jimena Bunster, did a wonderful book with a co-author of hers called Sellers and Servants about women who were domestic workers, usually Andean indigenous women coming down to Lima to work as usually quite abused domestic workers, and women who were street vendors. And Jimena particularly was interested in the women street vendors. And she said one of the things that she discovered, which I mean, this is the good news about doing research. Be ready to be surprised, right? And don't be embarrassed. It's the good news. Be surprised. And she was surprised at how clear these very enterprising, very gutsy, oftentimes themselves single mothers, these women street vendors in Lima, how clear they were about where their daughters could go and where their sons could go. They kept their daughters really within a block of their own street vending site. They assumed that their sons could run to the central market and get a resupply, could go all over the city, because that's what boys do. Girls have to be protected, so they have to be close to home. It's one of the reasons that parents can convince themselves that it's for the girl's own good that she not go to school, because in a war zone, going to school is so dangerous. They'll take the girls out of school before they'll take the boys out of school. Is it just about raw sexism? Girls, their daughters matter less than their sons? No, it's about good parenting, trying to think about protection, trying to be a responsible parent in a war zone. You try to think, what awful things will happen to your son? What awful thing will happen to your daughter? And you think your daughter's more vulnerable, keep her at home, she needs to be protected, even if you leave your son in school at least for another 6 months until the violence gets too bad. But to the extent that to be feminine to be feminized as the protected, it means therefore that you are presumed to be less knowledgeable about the world. This is all about politics. Now we're getting into something that even certain kinds of political scientists would recognize as politics. I'm always hopeful. Not here at Westminster, where everything's political. But if you are categorized as the protected because you're a child, or because you're female, or because you're feminized, any one of those three, then the presumption is your protector is the person who has to know a lot about the world, because how else can he be an effective protector? Watch what's going to happen to political knowledge. Who knows about politics? The person who can move in wider circles, the person who is out there and can gather wider information. The person who's protected is the person who has less access to wider knowledge. So the beliefs about who's the protector and who's the protected actually have profound ripple effects on who is able to gain political information and therefore sound as though they really can be a full citizen, sound as though they really can fashion ideas about how this political system works. So ideas, not just values, are what are at work in the making of a militarized society. A fifth idea, are we up to 5? A fifth idea is that every state that wants to be seen as a legitimate state has to have a military. That a state without a military is not a quote-unquote real state. The values come along with how much defense budget you're going to give, how much influence they'll have in the cabinet, but as far as just saying, is that a real state or not, having a state military has become, this is all human ideas. And it's mainly ideas not created by generals. I won't let any military officer off the hook, but we are the problem. People who write constitutions are mainly, not always, but mainly are civilians. They look like lawyers, they look like democratic theorists, they look like citizen activists, and they write constitutions. So, name the countries in the world whose societies, whose citizens, have decided that they will be a state and they demand to be recognized at the UN and other places as legitimate states, but have made a decision, a conscious decision not to have a state military. Costa Rica, absolutely Costa Rica. And you know, because you immediately thought of it, 1948. You want a research project? Go and find out why Costa Ricans decided in 1948, they were already a state. They had won independence from Spain long before that. Why did Costa Ricans decide to do away with their military in 1948? The little I know about this process is that they decided they were having so many wars with their neighbor El Salvador, oftentimes set off by soccer matches. I mean, you know, this isn't way out of bounds, is it? Right? Right? The militarization of soccer rivalries. And they decided that there would be fewer wars with their neighbors if they didn't have a military. That having a military didn't protect them. Having a military was the general thinking. Having a military, in fact, increased their insecurity by increasing the incidence of violent conflicts with their neighbors. Name a second where a country, citizens, decided to have a sovereign nation state, but to do it without having a state military. Say it again? Oh, Kiribati. Kiribati, I think Tonga has one. Kiribati and Samoa don't have militaries. Right next door, so don't just think, oh, little island countries don't have militaries. No, 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 you can militarize anything. And so Kiribati and Samoans both decided, Tonga has a military, Fiji has a very politically influential military. It's not about being a South Pacific, beautiful, you know, coconuts to eat every day island country. No, no, that's just a racist presumption. You have to watch why countries in a region made different decisions. And Iceland. Iceland made a decision not to have a military. They are in NATO, as any Icelandic feminist will tell you. All right? So again, Icelandic feminists are constantly, I mean, I come from the US. I teach in Iceland once a year. And so of course I don't ever think I'm in paradise. We were just there in what, February, April? April. But you know, you come from the US and you go to Reykjavik and you think, well, this is pretty good, you know. So it takes Icelandic feminists to say, don't you do that to us. Don't you romanticize us. Don't you turn us into, you know, people that don't have problems. We have a lot of problems. But the Icelandic men and women decided not to have a military, but to have membership in NATO, mainly because they were pressured by the United States government to be in militaries, to be in NATO, so that the US, if they need to, can use Iceland as a Air Force and Navy base. But that belief, because think how rare, think how few countries we've just mentioned, that belief that to be a mature, in quotes, I can see you, hi, this is great, that to be a state that's recognized by others as a quote-unquote mature state requires that you have a state military. That, again, is a belief. It's a belief that shapes how you evaluate, that's values, politics and political life. One final belief just to put out there to keep track of, and that is that soldiering is closer to real citizenship than any other kind of citizen activity. That to soldier is somehow to be a real contributor to a country. In American English, the phrase oftentimes is used, and it's used oftentimes by people who are trying to fight homophobia in the US military or to fight sexism in the US military. And in the 1940s and 50s, to fight racism in the US military, the phrase is used that I want to be able to serve. You always have to watch the word serve. It's never fight. I want to serve in the military to prove that I'm a first-class citizen. That's the militarization of citizenship. So this wedding in our belief systems of soldiering together with genuine citizenship has had a profound effect, even though we've done away with conscription in so many countries. There are very few countries now that have formal conscription, many fewer than there were at the end of the Cold War. But the extent to which soldiering, by women now as well as men, gets you closer to full citizenship is a belief that sends the roots of militarization further down. And to the extent to which most militaries are at least 90% male, the country with the highest, besides Israel, the country with the highest percentage of women in their state active duty military, well, 2 or 3 of them are together. South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the United States is just 14%. These other countries are closer to 15, 16, even 17%. But the extent to which militaries are not only masculinized, but are thought to be the guarantors of your status individually as a real citizen, pushes the whole society further down the road towards militarization. Finally, what does this mean then, because this won't have to be all grim, what does this mean about demilitarization? How do you demilitarize yourself? That's a good place to start, by the way. Don't start with Colombia, right? Start with yourself. To what extent are the things you admire, or the things you believe in, or the things you take for granted, or the things you assume, to what extent, as embarrassing as it is to acknowledge it, are they really, if not fully militarized, at least partially militarized? Then try to think about how you demilitarize yourself. Try to think how you would demilitarize whatever institutions you're involved in. Try to demilitarize your sense of what you think peace looks like and who are the guarantors of peace. Then start thinking about how would you demilitarize the United Nations, which is militarized not just by the UN peacekeeping office, it's primarily militarized by the civilians that control the Security Council, particularly what are called the P5, the Permanent Five, who have veto power, including Britain, of course. Try to think about how you would demilitarize institutions that don't, on the face of it, look as though they are primarily military institutions. And when you do your studies of anything, ask the extent to which that institution is creeping towards militarization or has effectively, at some moment, maybe now, pushing back towards a more demilitarized way of being a successful institution. But ask the questions always with an eye to the extent to which ideas about masculinities and ideas about femininities are fueling militarization. You have to, I think, I spent so long not being a feminist, and I try to remember how dumb I was, right? It's really important to remember your dumb phase, right? And Dan is so nice, he didn't put up any of my dumb books. These were all books that I've worked on since I became a feminist. But in my non-feminist era, I didn't ask questions about how power actually works because I did not take women's lives seriously. And if I don't take women's lives seriously, I will never figure out how power actually operates, which means if I want to reform the way power distorts our lives and our societies, I will never effectively be able to do it because I haven't taken women's lives seriously, and therefore I don't understand how either masculinities or femininities work in our society. So be smarter and make me smarter. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. If anyone has any questions, this microphone is connected to the TV. I will run up and try and pass you the microphone, and if you could help me in passing it along, and there's another one as well. Okay.
And could we say that if you want to make a point, tell a story, and you don't want to be on television, could you just say that right at the start? Because then you won't be televised, but you can still share with us something that you think you really want to share. So don't feel you have to be on tape to ask your question or make your observation.
Thank you very much for that, Cynthia. Could you give us maybe some tips specifically on how we can find Syrian feminists and read and hear their work?
Yes, that's a really good point. One of the places to start is with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. All right, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. They were formed in 1915. They're the oldest women's international peace organization in the world. And their website is www.wilpf.org. And WILP, out of Geneva, has had a really remarkable project to try and bring, this is really interesting, to bring Syrian feminists together with Bosnian feminists so that they can share without the US being part of it, without Britain being part of it, right? Some of the best feminist work that's being done is without the major powers kind of having to convene it or moderate it or whatever. And what WILP has done is brought Syrian feminists, some of whom have a very hard time getting out. They come to the week-long meeting and they go back. Now that to me is remarkable, remarkable. And they have met now two or three times, and WILP in English has written several reports on them. There's also another feminist online organization. WILP has grassroots branches all over the world, but this is an online investigatory feminist group, and it's called ICAN, all in caps, ICAN, and of course it stands for something, right? If I can remember what. Probably has information or ICAN. And it was started by an Iranian feminist, and it has been doing investigatory reports, so it's www.ican.org. And it has done, and it usually, the whole series is called What Do Women Want? But it's based on very gritty interviews with women in very particular war zones, and that has included both Iraq and Syria. So that's another good source. You can, when you look at any of these reports, NGO reports sometimes, you know, now are so valuable, right? Don't just stick to the published, you know, this sort of thing. Be sure, or if you do look at that, then be sure and read all the notes and see all the international NGOs that I've depended on, right? But there are some wonderful, very gutsy kinds of investigatory reporting being done by feminists, either in feminist organizations like ICAN and WILP, but also feminists inside of Human Rights Watch feminists organized inside of Human Rights Watch about 15 years ago, and that's the reason Human Rights Watch now has more of a feminist curiosity than it did. And that's the same thing true of Amnesty International and of a lot of the refugee rights organizations. So look at reports, and you can find Syrians speaking. And of course, they won't all have the same ideas. One of the biggest, and this isn't telling tales out of school, one of the hardest things for Syrian feminists to not agree on so much, but to agree to disagree so that they can do something together is the bottom line the ouster of Assad? Or are there other things more important now than demanding the ouster of Assad? And if you are a Syrian feminist, this is a woman who was just meeting in a transnational discussion and was going back. If you are a woman in your late 20s and you have seen your mother, you've seen your mother killed by an Assad soldier, it is not easy to think, okay, maybe there are other things that matter more than the ouster of the Assad and Ba'athist regime. So don't think that Syrian feminists, you wouldn't anyway because you're all smart, but don't slip into imagining that they're homogeneous. Don't imagine they all get along. Don't imagine that they all naturally agree on some feminist priorities. Life in a war zone is so complicated. It is so difficult to find what you do agree on and then make that overarching the things that you know you really disagree on. Yeah. Hi. Oh, whoop, we got the mic. Yes, we.
Hi, Cynthia, thank you. That was a real privilege to hear you speak.
Oh, thank you.
I work for Forces Watch, which is...
Oh, you do, of course.
Yeah, you know Forces Watch.
Yes,
so
I do.
Others who don't know, we work on the militarization of civil society and education. And I wondered if you might have something to say specifically...
Particularly here in Britain, right?
Yes, we're based in the UK, and we look at the militarization of UK society and education. And I've just been last week in the Scottish Parliament, and we were talking about the visits of armed forces recruiters to Scottish schools, which they do in England and in Wales as well. And they're going to be launching a public inquiry into that in Scotland. And I wondered if you might make some comment about armed forces visits to schools in the UK, and
or any place.
The militarization of education, and what you think about that and how we might combat it.
Yes, because they usually are parent-driven movements in many countries where there is, because so many militaries now depend not on conscription, they depend on volunteers. And they depend on volunteers that get interested at about age 16, get really enticed by 17, and then with their parents' agreement actually enlist at 18. So 16, 17, those are crucial years, and militaries who are, they are constantly hungry for new recruits because they won't lower the number of soldiers in the state military. I mean, you don't have to be hungry for recruits if your military is, 300 people. But as a result, schools are a main target, that's a very militarized language, but our main focus for military recruiters. Now, the militarization of schools involves the militarization of very particular people around schooling. The principals or the school heads, if there are publicly elected school boards, usually made up of parents, they're very important in the militarization of schools, and individual teachers. So one of the reasons that the British forces have access, and I don't need to tell you this, but for all of us, one of the reasons that the British forces have access to British civilian schools, and this is true in the United States too, is that so many school heads think it's just another career option and their students should have access to learning more about that option. The second belief is that parents on school boards believe it's part of national security support on their part. Not just the students' own options, but also that the school should be contributing to either a patriotic effort or to a national security effort. And to get underneath those beliefs is so crucial to get any kind of resistance to forces recruiting in schools. Not to mention that 16 and 17-year-olds shouldn't be the object of that kind of recruiting anyway. The third thing is how the forces go about it, because they go about it knowing they're dealing with children. If you look at a lot of recruiting drives by defense ministries, or in my country, Defense Department, in fact, they really play on the delight in games, in the fun of, definitely in quotes, of climbing into a tank, of playing military games. That is, they play children's games to entice children, 16 and 17-year-olds. Now, this is really hard because when you were 16 and 17, you didn't want anyone to call you a child. But under international law, under 18 is a child and protected under international law for the rights of the child. So it's the kind of work you're doing, my guess, is very difficult because you're not just trying to resist the Ministry of Defense and their actions. You're actually trying to change the minds of parents and teachers and school heads about what does it mean to be patriotic, what does it mean to give your school children options, what does it mean to be an equal opportunity provider. Ron, you've done some of this work, haven't you? This is Bron Ware, who's written a lot about the British military. Say it just a little louder. Say it just a little louder so people can hear.
Right, let me get that.
Yeah, right. We've, so let's give a little plug for the conference. Give a plug.
Well, yes, I don't know your name.
See, you have to come to Westminster to know each other.
Where is it? It's in Friend's house? It's in Friend's house.
On Euston Road?
There's an organisation called Movement to Abolish War, which has a base in SOAS around the corner. And they're partly organising this conference.
So Movement to Abolish War.
Yes.
Look it up on the web. Friends House Conference.
October the 8th.
October the 8th.
Which is a Saturday.
Right.
So the extra weight of the campaign in this country is that the British military can recruit people at the age of 16.
Oh, that's right.
At the age of 16 and so many months. So it's actually quite unusual.
Yes, and in fact, it's one of the reasons that the British government, this is about militarization of children. The British government and the US government are amongst the few wealthier countries who have refused to sign the UN Treaty on the Rights of the Child. Why? Because if they signed on to the UN Treaty on the Rights of the Child, they would not be able to recruit children at the age of 16. And it was one of the main arguments that made the US Senate, which controls treaty making in the US, not sign the Rights of the Child International Treaty because it would, quote, limit the Pentagon's recruiting. Yes, hi.
Hi. So,
Oh, wait, what, bring down, so, yeah, wait. We don't want to miss a word.
I'm sorry, it's just mine.
Oh, you've got, okay, so we'll move the mic around and then you're next.
Hi, my name's Claire. I'm from the Bristol Gender and IR program. There's a few of us here.
Oh, good. Hi, Bristol. Hi there.
But when you were talking about militarization of the media, and how sort of war stories are the things that are reported on, it made me wonder about what you thought about sort of social media as a way of pushing back against demilitarization, because it's not mediated.
Yes, and I think a lot of effective demilitarization is telling alternative stories through the social media. I mean, the social media, anything can be militarized. So the valorization of wartime heroes, the trashing of anybody who questions wartime heroes is brutal, if any of you tried to do it. So social media itself isn't automatically a tool for demilitarization any more than it's a tool for gender equality. It's a tool, and it depends who uses it for what purposes. But certainly, a lot of parents, for instance, around this whole question about recruiters' access to schools, a lot of parents have found out they're not the only one not wanting their child to get recruitment literature in the mail or have a uniformed recruiter in their school cafeteria, because they've heard of other parents on social media, and that's given them some kind of confidence to speak out. Because one of the ways that militarization works is it makes anyone who thinks they've got an alternative idea feel as though they are isolated. And silence that's why feminist studies is so important, because one of the things that feminists have tried to do is to study silence. Silence is so powerful, but it is so hard to study. I mean, what you study is talk, right? What you study is print. What you study is expression. To study silence as it works to disempower people is really hard, but the social media oftentimes give people enough sense, unless somebody finds out their identity, and then it becomes very, very tough. But it gives them a sense that they're not the only ones. They're not the only ones who don't want to stand for the national anthem. They're not the only ones who don't think that every soldier is a hero. They're not the only ones who refuse to use the word warrior. By the way, you can trace that in American English. That was not a term used during World War II, the Korean War, even the US war in Vietnam. It's a new term, and it kind of adds Greek classicism to the valorization of people in the state military. But if you don't think that, and you refuse to use the warrior word, or you refuse to think that every member of the state's military is a hero, you can oftentimes feel very silenced. And social media allows you to think you're not alone. Right? Yes. Well, oh yeah, you had, okay, you're first. Okay.
Is that okay?
The power of the mic. See, we're seeing it at work here.
Thank you. So I'm from the University of Glasgow, and we've got a researcher up there doing some work into how to make drones, how to be better at making drones.
Oh boy.
And we know for a fact that our university is taking money from BAE Systems, as I assume are other universities.
BAE Systems, you should know, is now ranked number 3 in the world as an arms manufacturer and exporter, and is British, BAE Systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, among other companies, I'm sure that are involved in militarization. So really my question is, what action can we do about that? And what about Clark University? Are these universities invested in the arms trade? How do we get them to divest? I feel like we should be kind of like forming a coalition like the AAA supported BDS. Like there should be some kind of coalition of action to try and get universities to divest from the arms trade.
Here in Britain, one of the groups that's been the longest existing and energetic resistors to Britain's complicity in the arms trade is CAT, Campaign Against the Arms Trade. CAT, C-A-T-T. They have an office up near King's Cross. What's the street that it's on? Yep, oh.
I work for Campaign Against Arms
Okay, that's who you, okay, wait, okay, this is good. Okay, say your name.
Poppy.
Poppy, and your name? Cat. That's great. Okay, the two of you are going to talk afterwards, but anybody else who's interested in this. But the militarization of universities is through the militarization of knowledge. And lots of different kinds of knowledge are necessary to run a modern military. So at my university, which doesn't have an engineering school, this matters a lot. This is not, my university is not, quote, pure. It just is a kind of university that isn't very attractive to the Pentagon because it doesn't have certain kinds of department strengths. Where is it? It is in the geography department. This is the Clark, you probably have never heard of it, but the Clark University geography department thinks of itself as one of the foremost geography departments in the world. You know, what we all do. But it really is, it is a terrific geography department in many ways. And, but it's got a cartography stream. And what do militaries need? They need cartographers. And the Pentagon, the last I heard, was the single biggest hiring employer for the cartography stream of the Clark Geography Department. And other graduate students tried to raise the flag on this, because part of a campaign is to make it visible as to what's going on. So at Glasgow, one of the things to do, not that you're not already thinking about this, but make it visible.
We've done a Freedom of Information Act to ask the university exactly how much money they're taking from who, and you know, there's lots of reasons why they can't tell us that.
Get some Glasgow journalist to work with you, right? Really good journalists know how to find out things that people don't want to tell, right? And they don't have to become an arm of your movement, just this is a story, right? How can you tell if your university is in any way, very maybe a small way, very maybe a short-term way, militarized? Militaries today in wealthy countries, militaries need psychologists, they need psychiatrists, they need engineers, they need clothing designers. Don't ever underestimate the debates about uniforms, right? Who designed the new uniforms for pregnant women soldiers? Somebody designed them. That wasn't done by some admiral, right? Militaries need they need family affairs, social workers, they need chaplains, they need all kinds of skills, all kinds of forms of knowledge. That doesn't mean everybody is an enemy. It means that to really figure out where militarization is occurring, you have to not assume from the start that you know. Engineering departments, physics departments, yeah, you probably would think about that. But you might not think about the psychology department, right? And it's about both contracts and hiring, so you look at both. Who on the faculty, and all universities now are desperate for funds. This is one of the things that greases the path towards militarization. If there was adequate state funding, then you could turn down a contract possibility that you didn't agree with educationally. But when you're strapped for money, because the state isn't providing sufficient money for higher education, then it means that even administrators who are not warmongers will find themselves pretty enticed, especially if they can persuade themselves, well, this isn't quite producing a machine gun. This is something much more abstract that may not be used as a weapon. Get an investigatory reporter interested. Yeah.
I apologize for jumping the queue, but I had asked before the event if I could do a shout out about something arms trade related. And I think
Oh, please, yes, please do.
As some of you might know, every other year, one of the largest arms fairs in the world takes place in East London, the Dicey Arms Fair. has around 1,500 arms companies exhibiting. It has military delegations from over 100 companies that come. And every time the arms fair comes, there are waves of protests, and these tend to get bigger every time. They're largely coordinated by Campaign Against Arms Trade that we were just talking about. And last year the event came, and a group of us organised as academics and students to oppose the arms fair, both because as academics who oppose militarism it felt important to make a demonstration, but also because, as we're talking about, universities are an increasingly intensely militarized space, and we wanted to make some kind of show about that. And so we held an academic conference outside the gates of the arms fair as they were trying to set it up. And so people presented papers on different aspects of militarization and resistance. We had discussions about how to confront and deal with the militarization of universities. The crescendo of the day came when Kim Hutchings gave her keynote paper, which was entitled War and Moral Stupidity, from the bus stop as activists lay in front of a tank that they were trying to deliver into the fair to exhibit. So it was an exciting day. It was a day where lots of people got to know each other. It was a day some people here were at. And the arms fair is coming back next September to East London. And we're already starting preparations for what to do next time and what to do that's bigger and more exciting and more interesting. We're in the pretty early days of planning at the moment, and what we're trying to get is expressions of interest. So if you think you might like to be involved in attending the event or helping organize the event, come and find me after this event, and I'll take your email address and I can be in touch.
That's great. And this Poppy, and that's Ross, right?
I'm Chris.
Chris, Poppy.
Chris Rossdale.
Good. I was partly right. And Kat. So you've got lots of people to talk to and make alliances with here. That's very interesting. Just because a social movement has a good cause doesn't mean it can't be sexist. And most of us have learned this the hard way. But it's worth learning and then relearning and then relearning. So there can be a movement, a civil society movement, a movement to end war, to end the arms trade, a counter-recruiting organization working against the militarization of schools, and still privilege not all, certain kinds of masculinity in the notion of who should be taken seriously in the organization, who's really seen as a good strategist, who's the best spokesperson, who really should be out in public as the face of the organization. All of those things can be sexist. And I think a lot of women in war zones find that. And so it means it's doubly, well, you know this, but it's doubly hard. On the one hand, you're really working against the odds in terms of violent repression, and at the same time, the groups that you associate with, civil society groups, trying to keep what little bits of the social fabric from coming totally unraveled, which means sustaining trust. That's what social fabric is. Interrelationships, interdependency, and trust. How do you keep it together? And to do that when, in fact, you don't feel, as women doing this work, that you're taken seriously by your male colleagues who are also taking risks, who are also trying to do important things. And it takes a kind of internal dialogue that seems as though it should come later. There's a great tendency when a social movement feels under enormous stress and maybe under danger to say, not now, later. I'll give you an example of this that I've been taught by a Vietnamese feminist historian. And she studied the Vietnamese emerging anti-colonial movement against the French in the 1920s and 30s in Vietnam. And there was one point, a crucial point. They were under enormous pressure from the French secret police. It was very dangerous to be an anti-colonial activist in Vietnam in the early 30s. But they had secret meetings, And at one meeting, a small group of Vietnamese women active in the nationalist movement wanted everyone to take up the question of domestic violence within the movement, between husbands and wives and partners in the movement. And the answer from the male leadership at the time was, not now. When? Later. Always beware of not now, later. And as a result, domestic violence, which is true in all kinds of movements, in all kinds of societies, was shelved, and only has now been taken up since 1975, 80, and Vietnamese feminists still have a hard time taking it up. They have to embrace it under the rubric that the state finds unthreatening, which is family happiness. And under that, they can raise issues of domestic violence. But the first time in this nationalist discourse where they were faced with repression by the French, and it was serious repression, was when they tried to bring up the question of sexual violence and violence against women in the nationalist movement. And the male leadership said, we're under too much pressure, things are too urgent, always watch for the word urgent. Somebody's going to wield it in the name of silencing somebody. It's too urgent, we're under too much pressure, not now, later, and later becomes never. So I think in various war zones, I think that's still true, and it's very hard. The WILP alliance with Bosnian feminists has provided some alternative space for these kinds of discussions to go on. One of the things that WILP has done is to bring together Bosnian feminists who are now 20 years beyond the Dayton Accords and living with the terrible flaws in the Dayton Accords, Bosnian feminists, Ukrainian feminists, and Syrian feminists, so that they had a space of trust and confidence and security, at least momentarily, to air these puzzles. And that seems to be one thing that is helpful. The worst thing is to be kind of trapped in a movement under pressure and have no place to talk about these things. It's an excruciating puzzle. So that's the one area I know there's an attempt to at least give some, not a safety valve, a place to kind of work these things out and even talk about, well, what kind of sexual violence are we talking about here, and who's doing it under whose license, and even those sorts of things are hard to talk about. Yeah. Hi.
Hi, Cynthia. I actually have 2 questions, if that's all right.
Make them shortened so I can remember them.
Quick.
That's the big problem.
The first one is, you mentioned how you didn't always consider yourself a feminist, and I was just wondering what made you identify as a feminist?
Okay, I'll answer that one fast.
Okay, and the second?
Friends and students.
Okay.
I mean, really, here's just a warning I've learned. Never be the most feminist person you know. Make sure you've got friends and colleagues that are more feminist than you are. It's never good to be the most feminist person you know, because you'll think you're doing all the pushing, whereas in fact you need to be pushed. So for me it was friends, British friends by the way, British friends and American friends in the 1970s, and then students who just, when I said, well, I don't know about that, they said, well, can't you learn? They wouldn't take no for an answer. So that's the quick answer to that one.
And the second one, I was wondering what you thought about the toy industry.
Oh, yeah.
And how, as we see those patterns of, the different sort of toys that get made for girls versus boys are, and how influential or potentially dangerous you think that is, and especially in 2016, and what you think people can do about it?
Do you know that the first toy soldiers, which were lead soldiers, you can still see them in museums, they were made to train elite boys in monarchical systems at an early age about their duty as a future soldier for the regime, right? So militarized toys and the socialization, there we go again, the ization, the socialization of boys into the naturalness of soldiering, or at least the admiration of soldiering, starts very, very early. And here again, oftentimes, women as mothers, oftentimes feeling that they really are responsible for their sons growing up to be, quote, normal boys, whatever that is, are the ones who take the boy by the hand down the aisle with the military toys. And the military toys are usually right next to the dump trucks. You know, that is, the masculinization of play can look very unmilitarized. You know, how many little girls really play with dump trucks? Well, dump trucks are great. They've got all those movable parts and you can make the, you know, but somehow at that early age, dump trucks are thought to be a boy's toy as versus any child's toy. I love dump trucks. But because they've got all those movable parts and you can make up games and toy, you know, stories around them. The big toy companies like Mattel and Hasbro, they're major companies. If you know, a lot of you have, I mean, you all have very different kind of aesthetics around your curiosities. Not everybody wants to study a play group, although that would be a really good thing to do, because you watch preschool teachers trying to take the gender out of play, even though the gendering of play has started at home. Or you find the play group is very gendered, and a well-meaning mother or father is then trying to de-gender the play when the child comes home. But if that's not really where your research skills or your research tastes lie, take on a big toy company and do a history of G.I. Joe. All right? Did anyone here have a brother or oneself that ever had a G.I. Joe toy? Ta-da! Right. You are not going to. And did you get one because you asked for it as a gift?
I got one off my dad, who makes weapons.
Yeah, right? And he thought it was a good thing for his daughter to play with?
They only have, and I played American football and all that jazz.
So you were the son.
I had Barbie as well.
So how did Barbie and G.I. Joe get along?
I didn't have a Ken, so you know that happened.
You didn't have a Ken, so you had G.I. Joe, right? The Barbie phenomenon and the G.I. Joe phenomenon, these are globalized toys. They are made in very particular parts of the world. So if you're interested in the globalization of production, go find where really popular toys are made. Find out what you can reveal about the gendering of toys in the production of them, the masculinization or feminization of them, the marketing of them. So you've got a lot of different tastes, and what really strikes you would be interesting to do as research. Find the level, in this case, from the everyday play to the international production of toys. Find some place to come together and with your tastes and reveal it. Mattel is the producer of Barbie, and Barbie now has a couple of very spiffy military uniforms, right? A dress Air Force uniform, and that you can cite exactly when that happened. Exactly when Mattel's toy designers decided that Barbie would be more attractive if one of her outfits was a military uniform. It wasn't at the beginning. You can historicize anything. And when you historicize something, you find where decisions are made. And when you find where decisions are made, you reveal politics. That's one of the reasons to ask historical questions. The gap, by the way, I ask these questions so that you all write about them and then send them to me. That's really what I'm doing here. Is the gap introduced camo. Do any of you have a camouflage tank top or a knapsack or a pair of sneakers, or is this too embarrassing to ask? Did any of you once, yeah, there you go, right, that camo, and now it's abbreviated to camo so that it won't sound so militarized. That was the fashion industry that did that. They took camouflage in garments and then abbreviated so most of us would forget it's really about being invisible so that you can shoot somebody. I mean, that's what camouflage is about. I mean, why do firefighters wear bright red? Because they want to be visible, right? Camouflage is to be invisible. The Gap corporate designers and marketers made a very specific decision in about, I used to know this for sure, about 2001, that they would introduce camo into their fashion line. Then they made, the next year, a decision they'd introduce camo into their Gap for Kids. Well, children actually don't buy clothes in the kids section of the Gap. Mothers do. So every child, and I'm always, this is terrible, you get infected with this and you just see it everywhere. But when I see a child with a little camo outfit on, I wonder, I really want to know, I mean truly want to know, what was she thinking? But I mean truly, what is she thinking? That it's just a beautiful pattern? Well then why not checks? Because the Gap's profit depends on her making some association that she thinks that camouflage is a cute outfit for a child. So look for decisions. And the way to look for decisions is to watch something over time that didn't exist, and then watch when it does exist, and then ask who made what decision then. And that's all because you asked this great toy question. I think we've got time for what, one more question?
Great.
Hi there.
Thank you, hi, thank you so much, Cynthia. My question follows on, I think, from the response you gave to the previous question
Yes.
about domestic violence. And I suppose my question is about the limits of the language of militarization and when it might not be helpful
Yes.
to talk about militarization. So for me, feminists are, amongst those who've done the most to help me understand militarism. In particular, the idea that there is a continuum of ordinary, everyday domestic violence, intimate partner violence, through to what political science and IR would generally think of as war. That if you are a woman living in a war zone, the distinction between ordinary everyday violence at home and the violence of the war they may not be that different. So feminism has done so much to help me understand militarism, but I'm not totally sure that the language of militarism and militarization always helps me understand gendered power relations.
True.
Because I don't know, so I'm interested in your response to this question about whether, does the language of militarization help women and men, or people who don't identify as women or men, understand the power and the violence of what we call domestic violence? So what would it mean if our question was, how can you tell if you're becoming, and then we'd put another term in there, a term like, I don't know, coerced, controlled, dominated? Because militarization ultimately is about power, and the focus on militarized or violent or militarized forms of power might hide some other things, which I think is especially pertinent in countries like the UK, where, I don't know, this might come across as this may be a caricature, but it's very easy for the liberal left to get concerned about rape as a tool of war in Congo, whilst not linking it up to or paying attention to ongoing horrific levels of domestic violence in our own society.
Yes.
And that becomes part of the problem of how we think about power and violence.
Yeah. I really do agree with you, because this is true of any concept. if something is everything, it's nothing. Right? If militarization is everything, how children play with Barbie, then it explains nothing. A concept is a made-up idea that shines a light on a pattern that you otherwise would miss. That's the whole point of concepts. Concepts make visible patterns that before you develop the concept looked random. That is domestic violence. That's a concept that you can date back just to the late 1960s. Sexual harassment, I can tell you exactly where that came from. That's about 1979. Before that, it was called flirting at work, or it was called lecherous bosses. Concepts are developed by feminists and others so that we can see a pattern where we think there is just randomness. Because once you can see a pattern, you can ask who's responsible for that. You can ask what are the consequences of that pattern being persistent. So militarization, I think you're absolutely right. Militarization cannot be used to describe everything or to explain everything, because then it loses its explanatory value. You can militarize domestic violence, but you can have domestic violence that is not militarized. So let me give you an example of militarized domestic violence. It is domestic, there are several different varieties of it. There are domestic violence incidences, patterns, that are denied, nobody's held accountable. The perpetrator, usually male, is not held accountable because it's thought to be not good for national security, capital N, capital S, to reveal the amount of interpersonal violence going on in some state's military. And a lot of military wives in a lot of countries have been totally silenced when they raise questions about their abusive soldier husbands, because the senior command does not want to hear it, and the civilians who control the military don't want to hear it either. That's the militarization of domestic violence. There can be domestic violence that has no particular reference to those specific militarized ideas, and they have to be tackled for their own sake. And you and I probably know Cynthia Coburn, and yes, right, both her work and her wonderful person. And Cynthia, the other Cynthia, when I sign my email, because we're on email together, I'm always the other Cynthia. She's the real Cynthia. Cynthia Coburn. And one of the things that she has introduced is this very powerful concept of the continuum of violence. Because oftentimes what happens is that you have a formal peace agreement signed by certain people. Usually the wielders of violence are the ones who are thought the only ones eligible to make peace. You want to hear what craziness sounds like? That only if you wield violence are you thought to be eligible for making peace. And that's how most peace negotiations are staffed. But the formal makers of peace do not want to hear about the ongoing violence that goes on after the peace agreement has been signed. They want to think they've just created peace. This is Bosnia for the last 20 years. And so work with ideas about militarization, but be as specific as you can so that you can be as useful as you can. And don't think it explains everything. Don't think any concept, as powerful as it is, as much as you see it as prevalent that you never used to see it, don't let it become everything or it explains nothing. Thank you all very much. You've been a wonderful group.